And so these are sort of the two responses to that. The first was integrationism, which is trying to appeal to the conscience of America and accommodate. The other is like, no, I can't and I won't. There's too many atrocities that have happened, and I don't have any sort of hope in the track record of anything that can rectify the past that's been done. But with this sort of line of thought, Cone says, of course, no black thinker has been a pure integrationist or a pure nationalist, but rather black intellectuals have represented aspects of each, with emphasis moving in one direction or the other, usually at different periods of their lives. That comes from page 4. So then Cone continues, he says, when blacks have been optimistic about America, believing that they could achieve full equality through moral suasion and legal argument, they have been integrationists and have minimized their nationalist tendencies. On the other hand, despair about America, believing that genuine equality is impossible because whites have no moral conscience or any intention to apply the laws fairly, has always been the seedbed of nationalism. So hopefully, and that's page 4, so hopefully these quotes are giving you some more insight into the nature of these two philosophical positions. These two philosophies also will be very helpful to think about in the background of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his philosophy, and also Malcolm X, which I call a lay philosopher because he really just didn't have the opportunity to get the academic aspects and the education. So, quote, to understand Martin King and Malcolm X's perspective on America and their respective philosophies and their relation to each other, it is important to see them in light of these two different but interdependent streams of black thought. This is Cone on page 4. And he continues about, contrasting these nationalist and integrationist stances. He says, quote, nationalists and integrationists were aware of the truth of each other's viewpoint, even though they did not always acknowledge it. Integrationists realized the danger of complete assimilation into American society. Like nationalists, they did not want to destroy the cultural and spiritual identity of blacks. That was perhaps the major reason why black churches and fraternal and sororal organizations remained separate from whites. Despite their repeated claim about 11 a.m. on Sunday morning being the most segregated hour of the week, black ministers and black denominations made no real efforts to integrate their churches. They knew that if they did, their power as blacks would have been greatly curtailed and their own cultural and spiritual identity destroyed. The advocates of integration therefore focused their energies primarily on the political and economic life of America. They believed that justice was possible if whites treated blacks as equals under law. Likewise, black nationalists realized the dangers of complete isolation from the political and economic life of America. That was perhaps the major reason for the frequent shifts in their philosophy. Black nationalism was not primarily a Western rational philosophy, but rather a black philosophy in search of its African roots. It was a cry for self-esteem, for the right to be recognized and accepted as human beings. Its advocates knew that blacks could not survive politically or economically in complete separation from others, especially whites in the United States. Neither could any other people, including whites, survive the isolation from the rest of the world. Everyone was interdependent. The black masses therefore did not follow nationalists because of their call for separation from America. Rather, it was because of the nationalists' ability to speak to their gut level experience that is, to express what it felt like to be black and white America. So this is Cone on page 15 and 16. That was a lot, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory. And one part that I think is important is that much of black nationalism is not a rational philosophy in the, academia rationalistic sense. It's not impersonal, blah, blah, blah. But it still has a lot of value, I think, if it's not taken in its most extreme manifestations. And I agree with what Cone said. It's the same with integrationism, that it also cannot be taken alone. So as Cone writes, either philosophy alone was a half-truth and thus a distortion of the black reality in America. Integrationists were practical. They advocated what they thought could be achieved at a given time. They knew that justice demanded more, but why demand it if you can't get it? Why demand it if the demand itself blocks the achievement of the other desirable and achievable goals? In their struggle for justice, they were careful not to arouse the genocidal instincts inherent in racism. Side note, this reminds me of King completely. I mean, that's the purpose of me putting this in here. Thus, they chose goals and methods which many whites accepted as reasonable and just. The strengths and weaknesses of the integrationist view are reflected in the life and ministry of Martin King. Cone. So, and that's page 16. So, next he's going to give us a rundown, sort of a description of nationalists and how it's, the strengths and weaknesses are also recognized in Malcolm X. He says, quote, "Nationalists were desperate. They spoke for that segment of the African American community which was hurting the most. Thus, they often did not consider carefully the consequences of their words and actions. The suffering of the black poor was so great that practical or rational philosophies did not arouse their allegiance. They needed a philosophy that could speak to their existence as black people living in a white society that did not recognize their humanity. They needed a philosophy that empowered them to, quote, respect black, unquote, by being prepared to die for it. Overwhelmed by misery, the black poor cried out for relief, for a word or an act that would lift them to another realm of existence, where they would be treated as human beings. In place of an American dream, nationalists gave the black poor an African dream. The strengths and weaknesses of this perspective were reflected in the life and ministry of Malcolm X." That's Cone, page 16.